So I'll start with the question while the room is still moving around. How today are we organizing the information that we're using with executive leadership when we're doing incident management or major crisis? Are we doing it in an incident response plan, possibly? Show of hands. And this thing is probably 150 pages, 250 pages, composed of multiple process guides, or we've decomposed it down to, I see people shaking their heads, or we decompose it down to like a page, and that's sufficient to cover everything they're going to need to know, right? So I'm going to propose here in this talk that we take a slightly different approach, that we try to condense the information down, and that we present it and use it in an interesting, possibly more meaningful way, and timed in a different way than what we've seen before in the past. I would argue that historically, when we have an incident within an organization, we rush out and we try to gather all types of information, and we hold off in presenting real information to the board. Problem is that when we do that, we're not allowing other activities to occur that we need. And by the time we go to talk to the board, they're expecting us to have all the answers. And that causes some contention, and it makes it a little bit harder to do your job. So if we do the briefing earlier and we call it a pre-briefing, technically it's a pre-briefing for a briefing, I would suggest that you're going to find that this is going to work much smoother. And then if you work it into your operational cadence, you're going to find that there's going to be an education path and a curve that results in training your executive leadership so that this becomes much easier to do. So the concept of this talk is pre-briefing, creating one and using it. I'm Rob Floodeen. I've been in London for the past 7 years. Before that, I was in Carnegie Mellon, over at Carnegie Mellon University at CertCC, the Software Engineering Institute. And for today, the outline, how I want to deliver this information, this outline is I want to give some background information. I want to talk about decision making. I want to talk about a couple of different pieces of things to think about, especially around information, internal, external information, this idea of irregular versus non-regular decision making, and then talk about timing and what that could look like by doing a pre-briefing versus waiting for something else. Then, of course, provide examples that you guys can walk away with and use within your organization. Okay. So the concept of a pre-briefing is synchronization on multiple items, et cetera. The big takeaway on this slide here is the bit in blue. So based on emerging information, the definition of information and what that really means. So the next few slides, we're going to dig into that a little bit more. And we're going to talk about decision readiness. Has anyone heard that term before, decision readiness? Okay, I see one hand. Good. So I'm not the only one. Great. So there's this concept that there's these benefits by helping people be ready to make a decision, this concept of decision readiness. And in this specific context of incident response and cybersecurity, we can do that by looking at things like confirming our priorities. So what are the priorities for the organization? What are the priorities for the response? What's the priorities for the specific type of incident? We can look at the risks and understand our risks. And then we can also look at some of our response actions. We can do all of these types of things before we know the details of the incident itself. So I would argue that we can do all of these types of things and get the executive leadership moved up to a place where they're ready to start making decisions and understand and increase their information. So when we're talking about information, what I really mean to say is this idea of internal versus external, which I've taken from Herbert Simon. And this concept of internal is, what are you made up of? You as the decision maker. So what's information to you? There's a number of things that go into that, like your habits, your skills. Today, we would say biases. So your biases, your experiences, things someone else has told you. Not necessarily any of this is true. And then so the other side of that would be external information. These would be things that I would think about, like facts of the case, facts as they unfold, information as it becomes available in this incident. And I would imagine that there's this sort of this gauge that balances between internal and external information. But I would caveat that you don't necessarily want to get rid of internal information for two reasons. The first reason is we have this concept of non-regular decision-making, which is based around expert intuition. So it's, you're an expert, you've done this 100 times, you've built all these mental models, you understand how everything works. You really don't need to have facts to know that it's going to go this way or this type of outcome is going to be expected. So you can pick that non-regular and you should listen to that. So that's the first reason we don't want to flatline out internal knowledge. The second is we kind of want to do a replacement program. So we want to help the decision makers, in this case, the executive leadership of the organization, replace some of the key pieces of information that they might have internally. So we want to test them, we want to remind them, we want to work with them and develop that, not get rid of it. So we want to help them become more of an expert so that that internal information becomes more relevant. If they become a little bit more of an expert, timeline to decision and decision readiness is going to be much faster as well. So we don't want them to become complacent and reliant on us for everything and external information. So they're sitting there waiting for us to come tell them what they need to know. Instead, we want to forewarn them and forearm them, right? So we do want to move it away from, you know, the things that they might have heard on the internet randomly or something on the radio that day. We want to move them to informed and capable of making better decisions. So in this model that Simon has, there's intelligence gathering, design, and then choice. And I would again argue, as I'm going to on every slide, that we can work with these items, specifically intelligence gathering and design of choices, prior to understanding the facts of an incident. So if I can get the pointer to go back, sorry, get the clicker to go back. Confirm priorities, risks, and response actions. Those are things that we can do prior to knowing the actual incident type. Okay, Simon had a couple of concepts that I think are really interesting here and worth sharing. First is this concept of degrees of uncertainty. So again, think of this lever going back and forth between internal and external. And external is where this uncertainty lives. And it lives a little bit in the internal where it's stuff that they have that's not necessarily true. So that'd be part of their beliefs. So if we can increase and change and work with the degrees of uncertainty, we can get to better decision making. And of course, I would argue again on this slide, we can do that before the incident, right? And then limitations of the decision maker is likely based on, and this is that list, previous experience, skills, habits, biases, values, and perceptions. So what they know, what they believe, or in other words, what they believe, what they know, and what they believe they know. And then lastly, we come to this concept of stress and time pressures, and then look at decisions, rational, non-rational, and irrational. Now, I don't know about you guys, but all the instances I've been in, there's been no stress and there's been no time pressure at all, like none. It's so easy. The fact that you're losing $8 million a day because one computer, an XP Windows system, for some reason is still running, is turned off, right? No stress, right? We can solve that problem easy. The reason this XP system is still running for the past 20 years is because it was easy to solve anyways. And now that it's off, it's even easier to solve, right? No, no, not at all. So what can we do ahead of time to look for this? Well, let's look at, speaking of time, let's look at how this can unfold. So what I have here is a real simple swim lane diagram. This concept of bronze, silver, gold team. Is that new to anybody? Is this the first time anybody's hearing this? Okay, if you're embarrassed, you can always like put your thumb in front of you, like yes, maybe, no. I can see that, but nobody else can. So I'll just cover that briefly. This idea that you have these groups of leaderships in bronze, silver, and gold. Bronze would be like at the operational level. So this would be like your team leads, your team managers. Silver would be like your team directors. Gold would be like your CISO, CIO types. And then I separate out the CEO and the board because I don't really see them as a gold team. I see them as a different set of decision makers and stakeholders. So the beautiful thing here is that as the incident unfolds, you're gathering information, you're going to a briefing, and then all of a sudden you start talking to them and you can see that we have questions popping up. Now, I don't know about you guys, but questions start to pop up for me right after slide 1. So you go into brief, you have 25 beautiful slides, well written, well executed, going to explain absolutely everything in perfect detail, which they don't need any of, by the way. And you get through slide 1 and then the questions come in and you never make it to slide 2. So this is how we're doing incidents today, right? not good. You end up spinning off into a black hole instead of leading your team, your board, your CISO, or your CEO and your senior team, senior executives. They have static, right? They don't know what's going on. They don't know what's coming next. They're waiting for you to fill them in, and you're busy chasing all these questions that they have. So in this case, I would argue we could do that before we have this incident, right? So we have this space, let's fill this space up. So I'm suggesting that we go back and look at the stages of decision-making, we employ that, and we create this concept of a pre-brief, the whole idea of this conversation today. So we have this pre-brief and we engage in a pre-brief, we train the pre-brief and we present this information. Now I can imagine Kauto up here asking me a question about how do you know when to do a pre-brief? Like when in the incident lifecycle do you do a pre-brief? What type of incident do you do pre-briefing for? I would argue that this is a consistent approach that I'm going to show you, and that if you did this too many times, it would just become background noise. And I would see that as a positive, because in that background noise, when the pre-briefing turns into background noise, you're affecting and increasing the replacement of the internal information versus the external information. So what I'm suggesting here and challenging here is that you really can't do this too many times. But I would argue the pacing probably matters. Like if you're telling your board every single day you have a small incident and they need to sit through a pre-briefing, they're probably going to get very frustrated with you. On the other hand, if you wait and do it once a year, it might not be effective. But if you did this as your annual training, it might make your annual training more effective. So there's some interesting dichotomies there when you're looking at timing for doing this such a thing. And the arrow here, by the way, that's a picnic. So just turned everything to a picnic, right? Went from, what did we go from? We went from a black hole and static to a picnic. Everyone loves a picnic. Picnics are awesome. Okay, so again, just going through that. So what are the types of things that I'm suggesting that we put into a pre-briefing now that we've talked about it so much? Well, I think there's some fundamental things that you really need to include. And I think once you see the fundamental things, you're going to agree, those are really fundamental. Do we really need those things? And I would say yes. The first time they read it, they'll read it once, they'll move on, they'll go back to it in 2 years if they're interested, or they might even skim over it. But if you don't have it there and you're relying on it for something, like a definition of something or an explanation of how something works, think of the 2 or 3 things you might have on that one pager for your IR plan. Those are the types of things that are going to be fundamental, right? Then there's key decisions, thresholds, and pre-approved responses. I think it was ICS for ICS. There was a mention of having an authoritative section who's authorized you to take these actions. So think of that. That can go in here as well. So these pre-approved responses, and these are going to be active as of the day the incident has started, not something that was approved in theory some months or years ago and it's been sitting on the shelf, right? So you've got these pre-approved responses that are going to be live and you're going to be authorized, or you're going to be, if we go back a few slides, you're going to be empowered. Oops. So you're going to be empowered at this point to start taking all these activities and all these actions. And you're going to have some fiduciary responsibility. You can go spend resources. Okay, so like I said, when you see it, it's going to be fundamental. This is fundamental. Anyone disagree? Okay, and I'm not going to suggest that this is what you want. I'm going to suggest that this is a place that you could start and then build your own definitions. But you should have definitions of key terms that you think are important for your organization. And there can absolutely be some internal things here as well. So if you have key critical mission systems and systems for mission execution, or if you have like specific types of contractors, or you have something that's just so unique that someone coming to your organization would not have heard this term or have known this term, this is a great place to put that in. You might also want to explain priority levels or severity levels. Some organizations use both, some don't. And so if you use both, you probably really want to articulate that, because when you call the IT manager in and they start to explain to the board about P1s and your board's waiting to hear S1s or S2s, there's going to be some confusion and confliction there. Then you also want to talk about teamwork, like teams and work streams and roles and responsibilities. You want to give some some filling, some depth of what that looks like, resource allocation. These are key questions and decisions that executive leadership is always going to be looking at. I mean, it's always like question 1, 2, or 3. Do we have what we need to get this done? So you want to articulate that on some regular basis. And you can take in the pre-briefing, you can take your default deck here and you can say, oh, and these 3 work streams, yeah, they're all off at the first conference, right? As we should be. You also want to provide some concept of how things work. So besides the timeline here, the real simple, and you could use this, but I would not use this. Besides some simple timeline of how things are going to unfold, because the pre-briefing occurs in the middle here, right? But you want to give a sense of how things unfold. I would recommend something a little more basic and easier to understand and follow. And so this is just the FEMA model. You don't have to create anything new. Go reuse it. So FEMA has something here. It's real simple: pre-incident response recovery. And on the right-hand side, you can just update this really quickly and just say, for this incident, we're currently at T plus 6 hours, right? We're in this phase. We suspect to be in this phase for this period of time. We think we might move out of this phase about here, but we don't know because we're just learning what the incident is. Key decisions, thresholds, pre-approved responses. Also in this section, I put in validating operational soundness. Not everyone is working off of, like an M365 environment. Some of us have actual physical and kinetic damage that can occur. I was doing an engagement for a small oil and gas company, and I said, right, let's work on your prioritization and your severity levels. And the CISO looked at me and said, Rob, calm down. Cyber only goes to 5. And I was like, okay, well, where's your chart go to? He's like, 7. Okay, that's a weird number. Why 7? He's like, well, at 6, things have blown up, and at 7, we've started killing people. I was like, okay, so we're going to 5. Got it. Not 11. So cyber is important. Responding to incidents is important, but we also need to make sure that when we're briefing executive leadership, that there's confidence that we know what needs to happen, not just we're going to go make sure that this computer, is sound from its confidentiality, integrity, and availability, but also we're not killing people because we're checking and working on these other processes that are also life critical. Right. So I add that in here as well. Awareness for incidents and reporting. So this one I caveat as awareness, because you got to sometimes tell people more than once some things. And so this is just like a general bucket. So you've made a bucket, you're helping create their mental model of what reporting looks like, what our requirements look like. And so this is the real soft and fuzzy teddy bear slide of what we need to do. Later, we have the real monstrous detailed slide of exactly what we need to do, which you also will need. So this one just says, hey, our current lowest regulatory reporting requirement is 36 hours. And our contractual reporting requirement is 48 hours, right? So the idea there is you might have some responsibility to clients. And we should also consider other entities. Since we don't know what this incident is yet, we should be thinking about these as we move forward and how we're going to deal with them. Then you're going to have some approved immediate actions. I would argue that these are very generic and that you're probably going to want your own set. And that this might be more than 1 slide. This might be like 5 slides. So what are all the things that you think you might need to do? I wouldn't bring 5 slides to the board the first time you go over this. I would have a couple key ones and then work on this over time as you mature with the organization as you go through it. Why? Why am I saying this? 2 reasons. The first one's obvious. Don't like slam the board. We had this great idea of doing something new. And oh, by the way, we're going to really lock you down for like 8 hours and just drive you crazy with asking questions and have you answer things that you have no idea about right now. That doesn't really work, right? And the second, though, is if you can get those few key pieces, you're going to find that your response processes and procedures are going to be so much easier. When there's doubt or there's paths in the way forward, you start trying to solve every case for your response. The real obvious and easy one in the room is always ransomware. Are we going to pay or not? If you don't know, think about what you have to do for the systems. Like, we don't know, but it's okay because we know we're going to make a decision in 8 hours. So what do you do for the next 8 hours? Or are you waiting for someone to make a decision? So what does that look like or feel like? What if you said, we're never going to pay a ransom ever? And that's fine. I'm not judging. Great. You're not going to pay a ransom ever. Awesome. So we know what we're going to do now. We are not going to reconstruct these systems. We're going to go rebuild them instead. We're not going to, try to decrypt some information and do something with it. We're just going to go out and start rebuilding. We've got backups rolling, all the 9 yards, right? Think about how it changes in your head of what you need to do for the next 8 hours now. Instantly changes. So if you can nail down some of these approved immediate actions, you can start thinking already about not just, oh, I can turn something off, but what avenues of decisions that you need to make as one of the managers, incident managers, just to make your life in running this much easier and presenting it as well. Okay, management questions defined. Rather large bank exercise last year. They wanted to do the whole gambit. So they wanted to start with a technical breach, and they wanted to move all the way through to briefing the board. Somewhere in the scoping process, going through all of this with the client, I paused the conversation. I've asked for a yellow sticky pad and a pen, and then I quickly wrote down 3 questions. And I've said, I'm going to show these to you, and I guarantee you the board's going to ask these 3 questions first. I was wrong. They only asked 2 of the 3 first. They asked the 3rd one fourth. So I got 1st, 3rd, and 4th. And the interesting thing is, if you know that ahead of time, you can then build out backup slides. So if you know what questions you think they might ask, that's great. You can build up backup slides. But we were still guessing. Wouldn't it be so much easier if you just talked to the board ahead of time and said, what questions are you going to have? And then document them and then have them on a regular basis so that you know where you need to go. You can then give this task to somebody else to go do and get all the information for you. And these questions probably aren't going to change very much, not based on what they need to do for their job, which is make decisions. So you're going to have some regularity in these management questions. Essentials, regulatory and contractual obligations. This is where you'd have this nice long slide deck. It might be an Excel sheet. It might be somewhere else. How many people are familiar with the risk registrar? So were the Europeans at in the room? Okay, yeah. So this could work very much like a risk registrar. So you could take all these different requirements. You could articulate the metadata associated with them. So like, what's the impact? What's the damage if you don't meet the requirement? What are the requirements you have to meet in case of a breach, for example? And then you just document it all. So the board doesn't need to guess. And if something's out of date, it's real easy to go to the person who owns it and says, I need this updated, please. And that's what I had for content. There is a bit of conclusion. Hopefully I've convinced you that there is some value here in trying to do this pre-briefing approach. If you wanted to use it, my recommendation is to do some type of a small tabletop exercise associated with using this document. Keep it real simple and real basic at first. Try to approach a couple of different pieces within each of the aspect. Don't flood them as you go towards it. And then what happens is every time you have another exercise or anything else, you're pulling this thing back out and you're reusing it over and over again, and it's going to mature over time as you develop. So you're helping the board understand what they need to know, and you're helping to increase that internal information and replace it. Thank you. Questions?
Thanks for the great talk. Thanks for the great talk, Robert. What are some common failure modes that you've seen with boards, and any tips to get around those?
What do you mean by failure modes?
I mean, like in their decision-making process, like, are there sort of patterns that you've seen of repeated misunderstandings or?
Sorry.
If that's not a well-defined question, just ignore it.
No, it's a great question. Just the water went down the wrong pipe at the right time. Yeah, so really what it is, it's the relationship devolves is the biggest issue. So you're bringing in technical people to brief a board member and not understanding the board and the senior execs like the CEO, CIO, et cetera, need to be making decisions. And so you're having the wrong conversation at the wrong time. It's just completely wrong conversation. Now, I'm not going to suggest or even boldly guess that happens most of the places. I would say it happens in a lot of immature, capable places. So I'm very positive there's some large companies out there and some mature companies that are doing this right, but they're probably doing it regularly, which is why they're getting it right. Not because they sat back and thought about how to do this, but just because they've done it so much that there's a cadence and something built in. So I wouldn't say it's we're making the wrong decision here. I would say it's more we're having the wrong conversation and we're having it at the wrong time.
Okay, thank you very much. We have time for more questions if there's any. If not, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, there is one question. Sorry.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I was delayed getting up. The pre-briefing, is it on a per incident basis, it sounds like you'd have a package that's kind of a template, but it would be tailored to that specific incident each time?
Yeah, so I'll draw a correlation for you. So I'm a governor for a high school, and every time we have to change a policy, you get the track changes. And so what you're really doing after you do the first one or two of these is you're just sending out the track changes and you're saying, here's the briefing, and they're probably just looking at it again. So it's that question, right? How often do you do this? And so if you're doing this once a year, it's going to be some type of in-person or video call. If you're doing this once every 3 weeks, depending on the size of your organization, it could just be sending them the PowerPoint slide and asking if they have questions.
Got it. So it would have the scenario details in it of that, like if you do it.
Oh, sorry. I see your questions. Yeah, if that's the way you built out the slide deck, you absolutely could do that. But if it's a hassle because you're doing it so frequently, you could just ignore that. And that would also possibly, depends on your board members, it could also possibly alleviate some contention early on as well.
Okay, I'm thinking about a CISO and their directs version of this.
Oh, then I would absolutely fill that out with what you could as you know it.
Yeah.
But then I would talk to legal to make sure it's okay.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Hello there. I've got a quick one as well. Great presentation, first of all.
Thank you.
Around kind of like the pre-brief. So does it have to be a slide deck or can it be kind of like a
No, it could
PDF,
be,
for example?
What's the there's like 3 or 4 different products out there now where it's like one big page and you just
Right.
put all the information on that one big page. That would absolutely work as well, because then you just copy the page over and then update it for that incident. And
Okay.
then you would have a nice running history so they could easily go back and see all the prior materials, and then you could link to everything. It could be a very nice, rich environment. It doesn't have to be a PowerPoint, but it depends on how they consume information. So it's really how they need it.
And in terms of the content, because you mentioned the fundamentals, kind of like making sure that we talk the same language, right? Some of them can be quite lengthy. Would you kind of like suggest kind of like having links to them or?
Tried that. Does not work at all.
Right.
Links don't work. It's insane. They're like, I'm not going to click on that. And so what happens is you just have a bunch of links. And so it turns in from an information page that they can quickly flip through and go, yep, yep, yep. And it changes from that into oh, this is a pile of homework. No, I'll wait until he talks to me. And then once he talks to me, I'll ask all the questions.
Right. So you suggest having the actual content on the slide deck, for example, or PDF?
Yeah, absolutely. But
Mm.
if you think it's going to be distracting, maybe you put it at the end and you can refer to it, but don't have it go somewhere else. You could link to it in the same document, but don't have it go to another page or something. Don't make it look like homework. Don't make them work.
Thanks a lot.
Sure.
Okay, thank you again.
Thank you.
No more questions.